We have come together to remember the Holocaust and all those who were persecuted and murdered during the years of Nazi tyranny. Our virtual gathering is a firm reminder of the difficult time we face as a country and the suffering that the coronavirus has brought here and throughout the world. At the outset, therefore, we share our thoughts with all who have lost loved ones to the pandemic and offer our ongoing appreciation to those who work to protect us. In compliance with the government's COVID-19 restrictions to keep everyone safe, our venue here in the Round Room at the Mansion House is empty this evening. There is significance in this emptiness. It reminds us of people who are no longer with us. On this evening of remembrance, it reminds us of the millions of Jewish people and their communities who were wiped away by the Holocaust, leaving a void where once vibrant Jewish life flourished. This evening's Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration is being broadcast online. Most of the readings have been pre-recorded. Some footage has been used from previous years. Every year, on this evening of commemoration, we solemnly mark Holocaust Memorial Day here in Dublin. We remember 6 million Jewish people murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. And we remember millions of other persecuted minorities who were victims of Nazi atrocities. This evening's ceremony provides us with the opportunity to cherish the memory of those who perished and to reflect on the consequences of the Holocaust.
The Holocaust was unprecedented in history. It was the intent by Nazi Germany to destroy the Jewish people of Europe, their history and their culture, and to murder other peoples because of their ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, religious or political beliefs. The Holocaust is an event that happened at the core of our civilization, the heart of our culture, and the midst of societies resembling our own. It was mainly about Jewish people, but its lessons are universal. Individuals, groups, and governments made choices that legalized discrimination, allowing justice, injustice, prejudice, and hatred to flourish that would ultimately justify and facilitate mass murder. The fear and uncertainty which prevailed in 1930s Europe nurtured the extremes which unleashed the cataclysmic disaster on the world that was the Holocaust. It did not emerge spontaneously. It was the results of seeds sown over hundreds of years, seeds of hatred, seeds of mistrust, seeds of anti-Semitism, and ultimately seeds of evil. Today, we are experiencing a surge in misinformation, an increase in anti-Semitism, and a prevalence of Holocaust denial and distortion. With few Holocaust survivors left to carry the burden of memory, the lessons of history grow dangerously dim. it becomes even more important to educate generations now living. Awareness of the Holocaust strengthens our resolve to rebut anti-Semitism in all its manifestations and to commit ourselves to challenging every example of intolerance that we witness.
The Lord Mayor of Dublin will welcome you.
On behalf of the City and people of Dublin, it is a great honour to host this important national event which is held every year in the Round Room at the Mansion House. We feel privileged to be among survivors of the Holocaust and descendants of survivors who have made Dublin and Ireland their home. Holocaust Memorial Day marks the date of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau on 27th of January 1945, which took place more than 75 years ago, less than a lifetime. Tonight we recall the suffering inflicted on the Jewish people of Europe and on all those of other faiths and ethnicities persecuted during the Holocaust. We will reflect on this and the suffering still being inflicted on people throughout the world today. We acknowledge the work of the Holocaust Education Trust Ireland in its endeavours to educate and inform about the Holocaust and ensure that this dark page of history is always remembered.
An Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, will address us.
I am honoured to make this address to Ireland's National Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration. I thank the Holocaust Education Trust Ireland for the invitation to speak at the ceremony and applaud them for the work that they are doing in creating awareness throughout Ireland about the Holocaust and its consequences. Despite the ongoing pandemic, the Trust has continued their education programmes, including the Crocus Project, where children plant yellow crocus bulbs, recalling the Star of David in memory of the children who perished in the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities. Education is a very important tool in deepening our understanding of the Holocaust and in fighting against racism and anti-Semitism. It is great to see children leading the way. Today's ceremony will be addressed by two Holocaust survivors, Tommy Reichenthal and Susie Diamond. Last year's ceremony marked the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And as we move further away from the horrors of the Holocaust, the value of being able to share the personal experience of Tommy and Susie is incalculable. And I know the work that they have been doing for so many years in educating so many people. On this Memorial Day, we remember the 6 million Jewish people, men, women, and children, who were brutally killed by the Nazis in gas chambers, in mass shootings, and in concentration camps. We remember further the others who perished at the hands of the Nazis, including members of the Roma community, people with disabilities, gay men and lesbians, other religious minorities, and those who spoke up in defense of minorities. Today we also remember the good and recall those who came to the assistance of the Jews. People such as Mary Elms, an Irish aid worker from my own home city of Cork, who risked her life to save the lives of hundreds of Jewish children during the Holocaust. I was proud when the people of Cork recognised the bravery of Mary Elms and decided by public vote in 2019 to name a bridge in Cork City in her honour. The Holocaust occurred in an international environment of division and conflict. What began with the othering of Jews moved to exclusion from society and denial of basic human rights and led to concentration camps, pogroms, and industrial-scale torture and murder. The year 2020 brought huge challenges to the international community and has, I hope, brought a greater awareness of how societies can change, the fragility of so much that we take for granted, and of the dangers of leaving discrimination to go unchecked. 2020 also marked the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. As global actors, we must all redouble our efforts to implement the values set out in the UN Charter, values which Ireland is deeply committed to upholding through our membership of the UN Security Council. Along with the other members of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Ireland last year adopted the 2020 Ministerial Declaration, which affirms the international community's commitment to combating Holocaust distortion, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination. Such measures are particularly important as anti-Semitism and racism once again begin to rise across Europe. And we are currently working on a number of measures across all areas of government designed to address hatred and intolerance in Ireland. The Department of Justice recently launched the findings from its public consultation on hate speech and hate crime, and also conducted extensive research into the approaches to dealing with hate crime in other jurisdictions. The purpose of this work is to ensure that we can identify how Ireland's law in this area can be improved, based on a clear understanding of the experiences of those impacted, while remaining in harmony with the very important right to free expression. In June 2020, the government appointed an anti-racism committee with the mandate to develop a new national action plan against racism. The committee's work and the new action plan builds upon a number of current and recent policy interventions aimed at combating racism and promoting the inclusion and integration of minorities. Other national and sectoral strategies aimed at eliminating discrimination include our Public Service 2020, the National Policy Framework for our Public Service, An Garda Síochána's Diversity and Integration Strategy, and our Sustainable, Inclusive and Empowered Communities Strategy. There are other examples of how we are fighting anti-Semitism and racism, and this is a fight that will need to be sustained with energy and application into the future as new technologies and ever-evolving platforms provide new opportunities for old prejudice and hate. Today is a particularly significant day in this regard in our annual calendar. It is the day on which I, as Taoiseach, reaffirm unequivocally and publicly Ireland's absolute commitment to Holocaust remembrance and to fighting the ugly scourge of anti-Semitism and racism. I want to finish by thanking the Holocaust survivors and their families, the Holocaust Education Trust and the Department of Justice for organising this event, all of today's speakers and everyone listening in for their contribution to remembering this most awful chapter of human history. Through remembrance and through education, we help ensure that nothing like it is ever allowed to happen again.
The Stockholm Declaration is an international agreement between governments committing to commemorate and educate about the Holocaust.
The governments attending the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust recognise that it was a tragically defining episode of the 20th century, a crisis for Europe and a universal catastrophe. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization. After more than half a century, it remains an event close enough in time that survivors can still bear witness to the horrors that engulfed the Jewish people. The terrible suffering of millions of Jewish people and other victims of the Nazis has left an indelible stain across Europe that must forever be seared in our collective memory. The selfless sacrifices of those who defied the Nazis and sometimes gave their own lives to protect or rescue Holocaust victims must also be inscribed in our hearts. With humanity still scarred by anti-Semitism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, racism, xenophobia, and other expressions of hatred, we commit to fight against these evils and to reaffirm our common aspiration for a democratic and tolerant society, free of prejudice and other forms of bigotry.
A handful of Jewish Holocaust survivors live in Ireland. All of them were children during the time of the Holocaust, and all of them found their way to Ireland by different means. Each of them lost many family members in the Shoah, and each has his or her own personal tale of survival. Tommy Reichenthal came to Ireland in 1959, where he later married and raised his family. For 50 years, he didn't speak about his Holocaust experiences. Tommy shares his story with us, which was recorded last year.
I'm here today not because who I am, but because what I am. I'm a Jew and I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. I was born in Slovakia in 1935. I was just 9 years old when I was captured by the Nazis, along with my mother, brother, grandmother, aunt, and cousin. We were herded into cattle cart, and from that moment onwards, we were treated worse than animals. There was no privacy, no hygiene. The stench and condition were unbearable. Eventually, after 7 nights in the cattle cart, train stopped. The doors were opened and we were greeted with shout from the SS with gun pointing and barking dogs. We had arrived at our destination, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I was there from November 1944 until the liberation of the camp in 15 April 1945. What I witnessed as a 9-year-old boy is impossible to describe. The starvation, the cruelty of the camp guards, the cold and disease, people who were just skin and bone and looked like living skeletons were walking around very slowly. Some of them dropped on the ground, never to get up again. They were dying in their hundreds. The emaciated bodies left where they fell or thrown into heap. In front of our barracks, there were piles of decomposing corpses. From many prisoners in Bergen-Belsen, the conditions were too much to bear, and they threw themselves on the barbed wire at night to be shot in order to put an end to their misery. We found their corpses there in the morning. 70,000 prisoners of Bergen-Belsen are buried there in mass grave. I lost 35 members of my family in the Holocaust.
The burning of Jewish books and works by authors considered un-German heralded the introduction of further anti-Jewish measures by the Nazis. Boycotts of Jewish businesses and professions were imposed. Jews were dismissed from their places of work and humiliated at every turn. Jews were banned from public places. such as cafes, cinemas, sports facilities, and even park benches had "Not for Jews" stenciled on them. The Nuremberg laws, drawn up in 1935, were designed to make Jewish people disappear from German society. Jews were deprived of their German citizenship. Jewish people were prohibited from marrying non-Jewish Germans. And for the first time, Jews were defined as a race. Jews were no longer able to earn a living. Jewish businesses were appropriated by the Nazi state, and Jewish banks and bank accounts held by Jews were confiscated. The Nuremberg laws took away their right to vote and deprived them of most of their civil rights and their human rights. By July 1938, as pressure was increased on Jews to leave Germany and German-occupied lands, hundreds of thousands tried to flee. President Roosevelt feared the unfolding of a Jewish refugee crisis and convened a conference in France to discuss offering refuge to Jewish people.
32 countries were represented at the Evin Conference, including Ireland. Delegates were asked if they would accept Jewish refugees. Most countries said they had no room for Jews or that their quotas were already full. One country even stated that no Jews is too many. With nowhere to turn, Jews found themselves trapped within their own borders. People are still fleeing discrimination, persecution, tyranny, and war, desperate to find refuge.
The state-sanctioned violence of the November pogrom, which erupted across Germany and Austria on the 9th of November 1938, marked a turning point in Nazi persecution of the Jewish people. After years of official harassment of Jews in Nazi Germany, the state-sanctioned violence of Kristallnacht marked the acceleration of the persecution that would ultimately culminate in the Holocaust. Everyone in Germany was required to carry identity papers, but special identifying marks were added to those of Jewish people. A large letter J was stamped on their passports, and the middle names of Sarah for females and Israel for males were introduced. In Poland, blue stars of David on white armbands were made compulsory, and in most countries under Nazi control, Jews were forced to wear yellow stars of David on their outer clothing.
The decree was issued that the Vilna Jewish population must put on badges front and back. I was ashamed to appear in them on the street, not because it would be noticed that I am a Jew, but because I was ashamed of what they were doing to us. I was ashamed of our helplessness.
More than 1,000 ghettos were created throughout Nazi-occupied Europe.
Jews, Roma, communists, homosexuals, and members of the organization were incarcerated in Nazi ghettos, which were created in every country occupied by Germans. More than 1 million people died in them. The Nazi ghettos were places of incarceration, brutality, and starvation. It had suited the Nazi if they could claim that people in the ghettos were dying from natural causes. Many ghettos were walled in or fenced off, and inmates who left them without permission were severely punished, often shot. The inhabitants of the ghettos soon realized that their eventual fate would be death. although there are heroic stories of resistance, most of the ghetto's population were murdered and there were few survivors.
Concentration camps were established from 1933 onwards. There were thousands of concentration camps, slave labor camps, and transit camps in the territories under German occupation. Jews and others incarcerated in these camps were worked to death or perished from brutality, exhaustion, cold, hunger, or disease. When the German army invaded Russia in June 1941, it was followed by special killing units tasked with killing Jews in all the towns and villages they passed through. These killing squads were made up of Nazi SS and police officers, members of the German army, and a great many local collaborators. They rounded up Jews in towns and villages, forcing them into cemeteries, forests, and ravines, where they were murdered in their thousands at point-blank range. Many had to dig their own graves before being shot into them. Entire Jewish communities, totaling some 2 million, as well as other victims, were annihilated in this method of face-to-face killing by the Nazis and their collaborators. Word was sent back to Berlin that some members of the killing squads found their work distressing. They asked head office to find a more efficient way of murdering Jews. And so the Wannsee Conference was convened.
On 20th January 1942, 15 high-ranking Nazis and government officials were invited by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich's Security Main Office, to a conference in a lakeside villa at Wannsee outside Berlin. He asked the delegates to endorse Hitler's plans to introduce mechanisms for the total annihilation of the Jewish people of Europe. Adolf Eichmann presented the delegates with a list of the number of Jews living in each European country whom the Nazis intended to annihilate. Ireland appears on the list with a total of 4,000 Jews. The delegates debated at length who was Jewish according to bloodline considerations and discussed evacuation and resettlement, euphemisms for murder. They concluded that a more efficient method of killing was necessary, one that would produce little residue and spare those operating the killing sites the negative psychological trauma of face-to-face killing. Over fine food, brandy and cigars, it took the delegates less than 2 hours to unanimously endorse Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question, the murder of the Jewish people by poison gas.
As a consequence of the Wannsee Conference, 6 death camps were established. All of the camps were on Polish soil, where approximately 3 million Jews and thousands of other victims were murdered in gas chambers. Prisoners were selected to live or to die. 90% were selected to die. Their clothing, shoes, and personal belongings were sorted and sold in markets back in Germany. Human hair was used in the manufacture of textiles. This systematic industrial process of murder was unprecedented in human history. Kitty Hart-Moxon from Poland was 16 years old when she was imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau. She still talks about her experiences today.
As evening came, the whole sky was red. Smoke and flames were pouring out of all the chimneys. Here were the death factories. It is barely credible to someone like myself, who lived through the worst of it, that members of a younger generation today cannot believe it happened at all. But I did live through it. I do know it happened. I was there.
The Holocaust was unprecedented in its planning, execution, and in its intent to destroy an entire people, its culture, and its history.
The final solution was the systematic intent by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder every Jew in every country of Europe, stretching as far north as Norway, as far south as Rhodes, as far east as Russia, and as far west as Ireland. They also included those Jews living in the countries of North Africa. 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. 1.5 million of those victims were children. The Nazis also murdered millions of other victims, but as Elie Wiesel reminds us, it is true that not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims.
We must prevent future generations from thinking of the Holocaust in terms of anonymous, faceless numbers. Every victim has a name. Several people living in Ireland lost cherished family members in the Holocaust, whose names we have included in the scroll of names. For some of them, we know their place of birth, their country of origin, their age, and their place of death. For others, we have only their names, and these are included in the scroll. In this small way, we honor their memory and give them a personal Irish memorial. The recording of reading the scroll of names is from 2020.
Max Heller, Clara Heller, Gisela Molnar, Sandar Molnar, Baila Hirschberg, Matthias Hirschberg, Rukla Orzel, Slasma Urbach, Hirsch Urbach, Tauba Urbach, David Joseph Urbach, Shaul Urbach, Abe Zvi Urbach, Gidla Freyla Urbach, Leah Freyla Urbach,
Sarah
Nukheim Mordecai Urbach,
Chil Urbach, Simon Urbach, Nukheim Urbach, Fegla Urbach, Perla Urbach, Freimeta Urbach, Moses Klein, Hilda Frankel, Kurt Frankel, Walter Frankel, Herbert Frankel, Fritz Frankel, Zygmunt Frankel, Solomon Delmont, Caroline Wolf,
Sally Wolf, Henrietta Wolf, Rosetta Wolf, Elie Velva Lavisansky, David Philip, Rekha Philip, Leopold Philip, Julia Philip, Dagbert Philip, Louis Philip from Minsk, Valeria Philip, Rosalia Shaimovitz, Julius Meyer, Geza Surrey, Oscar Shaimovitz,
Katerina Fried, Agnes Fried, Ezekiel Reichenthal, Katerina Reichenthal, Kalmar Reichenthal, Ilona Reichenthal, Jutta Reichenthal, Ibai Reichenthal, Desider Reichenthal, Ferdinand Alt, Renka Alt, Erna Elbert, Marta Elbert, Joseph Drexler, Medriska Drexler,
Bella Perlberg, Irma Popper, Yura Mataya, Ifsha Mataya, Ankisha Mataya, Kalman Rosenthal, Eleonora Rosenthal, Abraham Sustil, Poland Sustil, David Sustil, Shemon Sustil, Regina Sustil, Rapé Sustil,
Lucy Sustil,
Marta Sustil, Shabtai Sustil,
Adela Sustil, Agedni Sustil Brudo, Emmanuel Brudo, Sustil children, Heinrich Heinbeck, Selma Heinbeck, Simka Zax, Rivka Zax, Burrell Zax, Zisa Zax, Nachman, 6, Hannah, 6, Aaron,
Bandit,
6,
6,
Hannah,
Leah,
Shirhai,
Zadok,
Joel, Dov, 6,
Jitel, Zax, Shoshana, Zax, Shina, Zax, Masha, Zax, Rosa, Zax, Tyla, Feek, Fackler, David, Mayer, Fackler, Moshe, Fackler, Gyla, Fackler, Shane Del, Milkman, Yehil, Milkman, Theo, Milkman, Joseph, Milkman, Pepi, Gerzib, Chaya, Milkman,
Maya Milkman, Noza Nota Fackler, Esther Zarker Yukubovich, Mimi Alta Malekman, Levi Fackler, Izzy Fackler, Nathan Fackler, Johanna Carlsberg Summer, Emil Summer, Etty Steinberg, Leon Gluck, Volchek Gluck, Hatzekel Abram, Belia Abram, Osiah
Ida
Joseph
Cohn,
Abram, Sigmund
Heinrich Herbst,
Segel Cohn,
Carolina Herbst, Elza Zimak, Denny Zimak, Abraham Humberg, Emma Humberg, Gerda Feist, Fanny Kaufman, Adolf Humberg, Raphael German, Karl German, David German, Hannah Matla Zibner, Rivka Zibner, Baby
Phelim
Zibner,
Frandla
Minla
Zeibner,
Zibner,
daughter of Frandla Zeibner, Shendla Zeibner, Joseph Zeibner, Mendel Kirsner, Shana Bella Kirsner, Obse Kirsner, Shana Riva Kirsner, Shifra Kirsner, Rash Kirsner, Yankel Kirsner, Wanda Camarino, Renato DeCori, Italo Camarino, Julia DeCori, Miriam Navtulovic,
Mayor Navtulovic, Sidonia Levdulovic, Hani Moskovica, Chaim Moskovich, Benjamin Moskovich, Mark Moskovich, Isidore Moskovich, Shimshon Hertz, Kyla Hertz, Shindel Hertz, Abraham Hertz, Roisa Hertz, Joseph Hertz, Lieb Hertz, Mayor Rashofsky, Rachel Rashofsky, Kyla Rashofsky, Hirsch Rashofsky,
Mikala Kachtov, Sayoma Kachtov, Devora Krasnik, Miriam Krasnik, Hannah Krasnik, Fega Krasnik, Annie Ottenwolf, David Glasson, Jeanette Glasson, Paul Talma, Sarah Talma, Isaac Shisi, Ephraim Sachs, Leonard Jean Sachs.
Allied troops started liberating Nazi concentration and death camps from July 1944 onwards. The Russians reached Auschwitz-Birkenau in January 1945. Displaced persons camps were established in many former concentration camps. Liberation was not always joyful for the survivors of the Holocaust, especially Jewish survivors who had lost everything: their families and their homes. Most had no one left and nowhere to go. They referred to themselves as the spared remnant. And yet, anti-Semitism still prevailed in those early years after the war, as more than 1,500 violent pogroms erupted against Jews in Central Europe.
We had been liberated. I was no longer only a number doomed to die in a Nazi gas chamber, a prisoner without the right to life. Germany had been defeated. Once again, I was an ordinary girl. True, I was different from other girls my age, very different in many ways, but I was free.
Dr. Bob Collis worked as a volunteer doctor in the former Bergen-Belsen concentration camp immediately after the war. He brought 6 orphaned children back with him to Ireland. Among those children were brother and sister Tibor and Susie Molnar, who Bob arranged to have adopted by a Jewish couple, Willie and Elsie Samuels. Susie shares her story with us, pre-recorded last year.
I was born Susie Molnar in a small town of Kozak in Hungary in 1942. We were a small family comprising my mother Gazella, my father Sandor, my brother Terry, and myself. In 1942, my father was forcefully conscripted into the slave labor service of the Hungarian army and deported to the Soviet Union, where he perished in 1943. In July 1944, Adolf Eichmann oversaw the roundup and deportation of nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews in just 8 weeks. The majority of them were sent directly to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where most of them perished in the gas chambers. Some were sent to other concentration camps. During these weeks, the Gestapo came for my mother, brother, and me. We were deported first to Ravensbrück and then to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. My mother died shortly after liberation. Terry and I were very young children when we came to Ireland. We grew up believing we were the only 2 members of our family to have survived. In 2007, Terry passed away, and I was the only one left. But things changed unexpectedly in 2015, when I was discovered by our first cousin still living in Kozak. He filled in some gaps in my family history. My father was one of 4 brothers who ran a timber business in Kozak. 2 of them perished in the Holocaust and 2 survived. I have since learned that I have other first cousins in Hungary and in the United States. I have a family. In the past couple of years, I visited Kozak, where I saw my grandfather's house, the Jewish cemetery where my grandparents are buried, and the synagogue where all my family prayed. 778 Jews lived in Kozak before the war. 461 of them were murdered in the Holocaust. There is a memorial scroll on the synagogue wall recording the Jews from Kozak who perished in the Holocaust. My family is listed on this scroll, but now it has to be corrected because my brother and I were not murdered. We survived.
There are thousands of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. They carry the history of their families on their shoulders.
Survivors of the Holocaust have very few relations. We've got used to having very small families, at least from one side. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts, no cousins. We've been endowed with the title second or third generation, and this brings with it an important responsibility to transmit the memory of the Holocaust to future generations. But we can also rejoice in our own lives, in our new families, our children and our grandchildren. Hitler did not win. One or both of our parents survived, and we are here, living our lives, looking toward the future.
Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Authority in Israel, inaugurated the award of Righteous Among the Nations to honor non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. Only a fraction of the Jewish people were saved. The righteous come from all walks of life and backgrounds. Individuals, families, organizations, and diplomats. They were nations such as Denmark, Bulgaria, and Albania. There were also righteous Germans, righteous Arabs, and righteous Muslims. Mary Elmes is the first Irish person to be awarded the righteous title. Working with her colleagues in the south of France, she succeeded in saving a number of Jewish children from the Nazis. Not only those who have been personally saved by the righteous owe them their lives, but all of their descendants do too. A great number of Holocaust survivors made their homes in Israel after the Second World War. Ambassador Ofrir Kariv will give his reading.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered to mark the International Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration in a very different way this year. Despite the somewhat strange circumstances we find ourselves in, the essence of what we are commemorating has not changed. The horrors of the Holocaust, what we call the Shoah in Hebrew, remain just as unimaginable. The evil that drove the systematic extermination of human beings is not diminished, even with the passing of time. Our duty to remember and honor the victims and ensure that such catastrophe never be repeated remains unchanged. In Israel, the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is Until the Very Last Jew, 80 years since the onset of mass annihilation. Jewish life that had existed for centuries in Eastern Europe was practically obliterated. Approximately 1 million Jews were murdered within the Soviet Union's pre-war borders, and some 1.5 million Jews were massacred by the Nazis in the territories annexed by the USSR between 1939 and 1940. In the last month of 1941, a comprehensive plan to exterminate all Jews was developed. The final solution, the systematic annihilation of Jews by Nazi Germany. By the end of the war, some 6 million Jews had been murdered. Even before the Nazis began to implement their evil plan of annihilation, Zionist Jews in the land of Israel, among them my grandparents, had already been working and struggling for decades to re-establish Jewish sovereignty in the land of our fathers. The modern state of Israel was finally established in 1948, 3 years after the Nazis were defeated. Many survivors of the Holocaust came to the newly independent state to rebuild their lives. They rekindled their spark of life, working to build a modern, dynamic, and democratic state of Israel. Unfortunately, however, racism and xenophobia are still haunting humanity. Today we say once more, never again. As anti-Semitism raises its ugly head in Europe and other places, sometimes taking new modern forms, it must be fought decisively. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, a comprehensive definition that includes all types of contemporary anti-Semitism, is an important tool to this end, and we hope to see more and more countries adopt it. As the nation state of the Jewish people and the home of its majority, Israel is committed to this goal and will continue to work with the rest of the international community towards its achievement.
Anastasia Crickley tells us about the challenges of anti-Semitism.
After the devastation of the Holocaust, which left 2/3 of the Jewish people of Europe murdered and their culture and history on the brink of oblivion, it was hard to imagine that Jewish life could be rebuilt on that troubled soil. Yet, that is what happened over decades in a more united continent. Reconciliation replaced mistrust, and those same nations began a process of critical self-examination, acknowledging the role that they and their citizens played in the Holocaust. It was this process, as much as the improving economic conditions, that restored European Jews' sense of confidence. Most European states have come to terms with their past, but can they handle the present? Today, Jews are being attacked in the streets, in synagogues, and in their homes. Leaders of Jewish communities are urging their members, for safety's sake, not to wear their kippot in public. Heavily armed police or military guards patrol in front of synagogues, Jewish schools, and Jewish institutions in a number of European countries. Hungarian Jews watch a populist government honour fascist-era leaders complicit in the crimes of the Holocaust. The rise in the number of white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements is gaining traction around the world. Social media is providing a conduit for fermenting hate speech and vile images, providing platforms where extremist rhetoric becomes legitimate. The more this language is repeated, and the more it seeps into the national discourse, the more it becomes acceptable and mainstreamed. Daubings on shop windows and synagogues are all too reminiscent of Kristallnacht that left property belonging to Jews destroyed, synagogues burned, and Jewish people murdered. Remembering that genocidal tragedy of the Holocaust in the last century leads us to address the challenges we face in the present one. Public declarations and acts of anti-Semitism are still hateful, prejudiced, and wrong. They must be called out for what they are, whenever and wherever they are manifested.
It is customary at Holocaust Memorial events to light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jewish people who perished in the Shoah. In Ireland, we also light candles in memory of all of the victims of Nazi atrocities. We are using video footage from 2020 for the candle lighting ceremony. In memory of the people with disabilities and disabling conditions who were murdered, forcibly sterilized, and starved to death by doctors and other willing helpers. We will always remember. In memory of ethnic minorities, Poles, and other Slavic peoples who were murdered, displaced, and forcibly Aryanized by the Nazis. We will always remember. In memory of the Romani people of Europe, who were rounded up, displaced, forcibly sterilized, and murdered during the Holocaust. We will always remember. In memory of homosexual men and women who were persecuted and murdered during the Holocaust because of their sexual orientation. We will always remember. In memory of the political victims of the Holocaust, communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other opponents of the Nazi regime who were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis. We will always remember. In memory of the Christian victims of all denominations who were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. we will always remember. Six candles are dedicated to the memory of the 6 million Jewish people, including 1.5 million children, who were annihilated in the Holocaust. Jews were murdered in concentration camps, labor camps, and death camps. Jews perished in the ghettos. Jews died of starvation and disease. Jews were shot in the forests and in their villages. And Jews were murdered in the streets and in their homes. Those lighting candles in memory of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust are children or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, second and third generation. All of them lost countless members of their families in the Holocaust. Tony Collis, whose grandfather Zoltan Zinn and great-aunt Edith survived Bergen-Belsen, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Kyla Herz, whose grandfather, Wulf Herz, escaped the massacre in the Bronica forest, and whose great-grandparents, Lenke and Avrum Muskowitsch, survived Auschwitz, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Yoram Tokar, whose great-uncle David, Aunt Jeanette Gelassen, Paul and Sarah Talma, and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Dikla Blum, whose grandfather Moshe Halperin, grandmother Bella Halperin, and great-aunt Sarah Halperin survived, but whose great-grandparents Michael and Henya Halperin and great-uncle Joseph Halperin and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Joe Katz, whose mother Frida survived Auschwitz, but whose many other family members perished in the Holocaust. Charlotte Kaplan, whose father Raphael Orbach survived Buchenwald and Theresienstadt concentration camps, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. We will always remember.
The Holocaust was intended not to have any witnesses. The Nazi plan was to erase an entire people from the history and memory of the world. The Jews were not supposed to survive. Everything was planned, thought out, and organized so as not to leave any evidence of the murderous project. The existence of the gas chambers was kept hidden like a state secret. The Nazi death machine was designed to eradicate not only Jews, Roma, and other peoples, but also all evidence of their annihilation. It was the survivors themselves who acknowledged their responsibility for passing on knowledge of the Holocaust and keeping its memory alive. For this reason, it is essential to teach about the Shoah, whether there are Jews in your respective countries or not, whether there are many or few or none left. The Shoah should never be diluted, denied, distorted, or trivialized. Our generation and the generation or two after us will be the last that will be able to say that we stood and shook the hands of some of those who survived. Go home from this place and tell your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren that today you looked into the eyes that witnessed the most cataclysmic events ever unleashed by mankind upon mankind. Tell them that you met people who will still be remembered and still talked about and still wept over 1,000 years from now. The Holocaust happened, and it can happen again. And every one of us has a solemn duty to ensure that nothing like it ever happens again.
I invite Rabbi Zalman Lent of the Irish Jewish community to recite the prayer for the repose of the souls of the departed.
O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the sheltering wings of your divine presence among the holy and pure who shine like the brightness of the firmament, for the souls of all the holy and pure and innocent who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled at the hands of the Nazi oppressors in Auschwitz, Belzec, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and other concentration and death camps in Europe. We now pray for those souls. May their resting places be in the Garden of Eden. And so may the Master of Mercy shelter them for eternity with the cover of his wings, and may he bind their souls in the bond of eternal life. May the Lord be their inheritance, and may they repose in peace upon their heavenly resting places. And let us say, Amen.
Amen.
As our ceremony closes, with Carl Nelken chanting the prayer for the repose of the souls of the departed, we thank you for joining us in this evening of solemn commemoration.
El Molei Rachamim Shochen Mamramim Hametzei Menuchon Echana Al Kanefei Hashchina B'malos kedoshim utaharim kezohar orakia mashirim es nishmos achenu b'nei Yisrael Hakedoshim hataharim shenaflu b'dei harotzchim v'nishmach damam ba'Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka ובשאר מחנות השמד באירופה שנהרגו, שנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על קידוש השם בעבור שכל הקול הקדוש הזה מתפללים ביד אזכרת נשמתם בגן עדן תהיה מנוחתם לכן בעל הרחמים ישתירם בססק כנופך לעולמים וצרור בשרור החיים אס נשמתם אדוני הוא נחלתם kvosom shalom. Venamor